Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 57, The Harries Family. I came across the Harries family when I found an old newspaper article outlining the gruesome discovery of a human leg found in the Edward River at Deniliquin, New South Wales in 1894. It was surmised that this was part of the body of Thomas Harries of Mathoura, a town close by to Deniliquin, who it was presumed had suicided by jumping off the bridge at Deniliquin in 1891. I was intrigued to know as to what drove Thomas to suicide and his background. His father, Thomas Harries Sr., was born in Liverpool, Lancashire, England in 1831. He emigrated to Victoria by 1855. He married Mary Jane O'Neill, who was also known as Kathleen, in about 1852 at Kilmore, Victoria. Mary was Irish and was born in 1828 in Antrim, Northern Ireland. Thomas was working as a shepherd and a boundary rider, and by 1855 were living in Heathcote, Victoria. They also lived at Bridgewater on Loddon. Mary died in 1899 in Moama, and Thomas died on the 17th of March 1909 at Moama. Thomas Harries was born in 1860 in Victoria, and he was the second child of 6 children. His family believed he had drowned in Deniliquin on the 20th of July 1891, aged only 31. And there was an article detailing the find. Evening News in Sydney on the 27th of November 1894. A Deniliquin sensation. Man's leg found in a river. Was it suicide? While the matron of the Deniliquin Hospital and several other persons were fishing on the bank of the Edward River at the rear of that institution on the 19th of November, a most singular discovery was made, one which afterwards caused considerable interest to be taken in the disclosure. An evening or so previous to last Monday, a boot was seen projecting through the sand in the river, but very little notice was taken of it. But on Monday afternoon, the river had fallen considerably, and it was found to be still in the same place and quite out of the water. On that evening, the boot again attracted attention, and on that occasion it was examined and removed from its position. But to the surprise of Mrs. Sargent, the matron, it was attached to a man's leg, or rather to bones of a man's leg. The bones, which are large and small bones of a man's leg, were perfectly free from all flesh and quite clean, but are discoloured by being so long in the water. The bones referred to are from the knee joint to the foot, the latter of which is firmly fixed in the boot, round the top of which may be seen remnants of a sock and filled up with mud or sand. The boot, which is well made, appears to be quite new and to have been very little worn. It is in an almost perfect state of preservation, and to look at would appear to have been in the water for only a few days, but that could not be, as it must have been in the water the same length of time as the leg. The bones are firmly set in the boot, which is securely laced up, and the size of the boot would appear to be a 5 or 6 number. After the discovery was made, the leg, or what remained of it, and the boot were handed over to the police, who are now making inquiries respecting the discovery. The next day the police made a further search in the vicinity of where the leg was found, but were unable to find any additional parts of a man's body. Several pieces of leather were found, but they may have been brought down by the stream and no significance can be attached to them. At the present time, the whole matter remains a mystery, and no idea can be formed how the leg came there. It is that of a man of only medium height and appears to be that of a person of only slight build, but the boot is very well finished and neat, and as it is well preserved, it may perhaps be recognised. In connection with this matter, it may be mentioned that a man named Thomas Harries, a selector near Mathoura, was supposed to have committed suicide by jumping off the Edward River Bridge at Deniliquin about 3 years ago, and as this is only about 500 yards upstream from where the leg was found, it is thought probable that the limb found is that of the man Thomas Harries. This surmise would appear to be perhaps correct, as Harries, on the morning of the supposed suicide, left on the bridge his coat and waistcoat, which contained his watch, money, and a letter to the effect that suicide was intended, and from that time to this nothing has been heard of him, although the police dragged the river afterwards. Sometime after this supposed suicide, it was rumoured that Thomas Harries was working on a station in the Lachlan, but that does not appear to be correct, and we think it is more than probable that the leg found is a portion of the body of Thomas Harries. In view of gaining all necessary information, the police are now in communication with his relatives, and further developments in the matter will be watched with interest. And in the Deniliquin Pastoral Times, in the same month, November 1894, there was a further article. A sensational discovery, a human leg found, an old mystery cleared up. Some excitement was created on Tuesday evening last by the discovery of a human leg in the police paddock Deniliquin. It appears that Mrs. Sargent, the matron of the Deniliquin Hospital, and another lady were fishing on the riverbank and proceeded down to the flat in the police paddock by Kyrie and across to a point just below the Big Bend, and when nearing the river their attention was attracted to what appeared to be a boot. One of the ladies attempted to pick up the boot and found that something was attached to it that was embedded in the sand beneath. With a little difficulty it was pulled out, and the ladies were horrified to find that the boot covered a human foot, and projecting out of it were two bones of the lower leg, apparently from a fully grown adult. The boot is known as a Balmoral lace-up, size about 6. The sole is unbroken, and the upper indicates that the boot was not much worn previous to the decease of the owner. The lace was broken in several places, but the breakages indicate that they occurred before the death of the wearer, as the knots had been tied in the ends of the laces to prevent them slipping through the lace holes of the boot. From the general appearance of the gruesome discovery, it would appear that the leg has been some years in its present position, and it is remarkable it was not found long ago, as the spot from which it is located is frequently passed over by those going fishing on the river in the police paddock. The locality of the discovery makes it more remarkable because it was at least 100 yards from the riverbank and apparently had been washed there during a fairly high flood. So far we are aware that there's only been one instance of drowning or supposed drowning at Deniliquin in which a body was not recovered. In this case there was some doubt at the time as to the person who, it was supposed, had committed suicide and had thrown himself in the river, or whether he had attempted to obscure his movements for some purpose known only to himself. The incident took place on the 21st of July 1891. During the early morning of that day, in fact shortly after daylight, a man was seen by a passing milkman near the centre of the Deniliquin Bridge. He was noticed to be walking backwards and forwards in an aimless sort of manner, but little attention was paid to him and the milkman passed on. Shortly afterwards a loud splash was heard in the river, but as nothing could be seen, only passing attention was paid to the matter until some time afterwards, when a coat was found hanging on one of the rails of the bridge. On the coat, being examined, it was found it contained a cheque for £7, a £1 note and an envelope on which latter was written some almost indistinct words. After much trouble, the writing was deciphered, or at least sufficient of it to indicate that the owner of the coat was tired of his life, and an intimation to the effect that his body would be found in the river. At that time, the gauge at the bridge showed that there was 20 foot of water in the river, and a big flood coming down from Tocumwal, which sent the water at Deniliquin up to 28 foot 6 inches within the next week. As soon as the writing on the envelope had been deciphered, it was naturally concluded that the case was one of suicide, and the police proceeded to drag the river. This was continued for some time without success, owing to the high state of the river, and after a day or two the search was abandoned. It was ascertained from the writing in the coat pocket, or rather it was surmised, that the person's name was Joseph Harries. This man, it was found on investigation, had come from Mathoura, in which neighbourhood he and his relatives owned some land and had some business to transact at the Deniliquin Land Office. But from inquiries made there, it was proved that he did not visit the office. The police then communicated with his relatives at Mathoura, and one of them came up to Deniliquin, but no fresh light was thrown on the case, and from that time to the present nothing had been heard of the missing man. It is now thought probable that the leg discovered on Tuesday last is a portion of his body, but unless some of the relatives who have been communicated with are in a position to identify the boot, it is probable that the mystery will remain unsolved. So Thomas Harries' siblings. The first child born in the family was Agnes, and she was born in Heathcote, Victoria on the 8th of March 1855. She married John Henry Ashton at Tarnagulla, Victoria, on the 3rd of September 1870. John was recorded at being born at sea when his family, his parents Thomas Ashton and Julia Nugent, travelled from Yorkshire, England to America. John was a farmer and later a drover and was 27 when he married Agnes, who was 16. They were both working at Woodstock on Loddon when they married. They had 7 children. Agnes died in Deniliquin on the 29th of May 1838 when she was 83. And the obituary for Mrs. Agnes Ashton: another former old resident of Hay, Mrs. Agnes Ashton, widow of the late John Henry Ashton, died at the home of her sister, Mrs. Robertson, Deniliquin, on Sunday at the age of 83 years. The deceased, who was a native of Victoria, came to the Hay district with her husband over 50 years ago. Mr. Ashton followed pastoral callings and for a number of years was a well-known district drover. He also had charge of district holdings at different times. He died at Hay in December 1915 after a lengthy illness. His widow continued to reside here but latterly went to live at Deniliquin. She was in good health till a couple of days before her death. She is survived by 3 sons, Percy in Sydney, Thomas in Forbes and Arthur W. in Hay, and one daughter, Mrs. J. H. Howard from Hay. One son, Benjamin, was killed in action in France, and another, Sydney, who also served at the front, was fatally wounded during the last days of the Australians in the front line. Mrs. Ashton made many friends in Hay, who will hear with regret of her death. So Percy Nugent Ashton, one of her sons, married Elizabeth Yarham, daughter of Charles and Adelaide Yarham, in Deniliquin in 1897. Percy and Elizabeth had 3 children, and his wife died in 1906, leaving him with a young family, the youngest being 3 years old. He then married Clara Rolfe in Sydney on the 29th of October 1910, and they lived at Liverpool after their marriage. Percy died in Liverpool on the 23rd of October 1944, aged 73. And as mentioned, 2 sons went to war and didn't survive. However, a third did go to the war and returned. So the 3 sons that went to war were Sydney, Ben and Arthur. Sydney married Elizabeth Bland in Wagga in 1914 prior to his enlistment. They had a daughter, Agnes, that same year. Sydney died on the 4th of September 1918 in France when his daughter was only 4 years old. The second son that went to war, Arthur William, he married Margaret McCormick in Hay in 1913. He was a boundary rider and a drover, and he enlisted on the 18th of April 1916. He fought in France and was wounded with a mild gunshot wound to the left leg in September 1917. He rose to the rank of corporal and was discharged in August 1818. He returned from the war and returned to Hay, where he was a station manager and a herdsman. And Benjamin Victor, the third son that went to the war, enlisted on the 5th of January 1916. He was a drover as well at the time of his enlistment. He fought in France and was killed in action on Christmas Eve 1916, less than 3 months after he was taken on strength with the 2nd Battalion. The second child in the family, so one of Thomas's siblings, was also Thomas. He was born in 1856 in Heathcote, Victoria, and died on the 7th of December 1856 in Heathcote. The third child, William Thomas, was born in Victoria in 1861. He married Sarah Hickey at Mathoura, New South Wales, in 1899 when he was 40. They had one son, William Thomas Jr., on the 3rd of April 1900 at Mathoura, and William Sr. died at Essendon, Victoria, on the 25th of April 1912, aged 51. The fourth child, Mary, was born in 1864 in Victoria. Mary married Thomas Dunn in Mathoura, New South Wales in 1901, when Thomas was 51 and Mary was 27. Mary was listed at living at Moira, a farming area near Mathoura, New South Wales, in 1903-1904. They had 2 children, and Mary died in Deniliquin in December 1914, aged 50. And there was an article mentioning the death of Thomas Dunn, and that was in 1934. Mr. Thomas Dunn, an old district identity, died suddenly at the residence of his sister-in-law, Mrs. Robertson, in Henry Street, Deniliquin. The deceased, who was 78 years, was for many years employed as a teamster for Faulkner and Sons at Bunnock Station. He had been living in retirement for a considerable time. His wife died 20 years ago and he leaves 2 children, a daughter who is a nun and a son, Mr. Chris Dunn. The fifth child, Margaret, known as Maggie, was born in Victoria in 1869 at Woodstock, Victoria. She married Charles Tollett in Moama in 1889 when she was 20 and he was 31. This was his second marriage. Charles owned a farm at Pretty Pine, a farming community near Deniliquin, and had 105 acres of land in 1897. And Charles and Margaret had 5 children. And the obituary of Charles Tollett outlines, the residents of Moama and District will regret to hear of the death of Mr. Charles Tollett, which occurred at Uxbridge House, Fitzroy, on Sunday. He had been suffering for about 6 months from jaundice and was taken to Melbourne on Friday morning for the purpose of undergoing special treatment. He, however, became worse and died early Sunday. The late Mr. Tollett was a native of Malden and was 62. He came to Moama 40 years ago and entered upon farming and grazing pursuits, in which he was most successful. He was twice married and is survived by a family of 5 children. So Margaret, or Maggie, she died in Echuca on the 12th of December 1908, aged only 41 when her youngest child was only 6. The 6th child, Annie, was born at Bridgewater-on-Loddon, Victoria in 1874. She married James Hamilton Robertson in Echuca on the 21st of March 1904. She was the sister-in-law of my great-great-aunt. James was a shareholder in the Deniliquin Moama Railway Company and was a station master who was based at Moama in 1904. They had 4 boys, and James died in 1914 in Deniliquin, leaving Annie with 4 children 10 and under. Annie died in Altona, Victoria in February 1950, aged 76. And the death of her husband was outlined on the 11th of May 1912. The death of Mr. J.H. Robertson. The many friends of J.H. Robertson, goods clerk at the Deniliquin and Moama railway station, were shocked at the announcement of his death on Sunday night after a few days' illness. Mr. Robertson was suffering from pneumonia and kidney trouble and was under the constant care of Dr. Hosking, but his condition did not improve and he passed away on Sunday evening. The deceased was the eldest son of the late Mr. A. Robertson, who was clerk in the employ of the Municipal Council for some years. About 25 years ago, he entered the service of Deniliquin and Moama Company and remained with the company up to the time of his death. For several years during that period, he was station master at Moama, but he returned to Deniliquin as goods clerk about 1905. In that capacity, he was regarded as a trustworthy and capable official who was very popular with his fellow employees and also with the businessmen of this town with whom he constantly came in contact. The deceased was only 42 years of age and leaves a widow and 4 young children for whom profound sympathy has been expressed in their bereavement. And we do find that there is a death notice that has been put in. It says, in sad and loving memory of our dear sister Maggie Tollett, who died at Echuca on the 12th of December 1908, one of God's purest and best, a fine woman. Also our dear father Thomas Harries, who died at Moama on the 11th of March 1909, and our dear mother Mary Kathleen Harries died at Moama on the 11th of January 1899. And our dear brother Thomas Harries, who was drowned at Deniliquin. And that was inserted by their sorrowing families, W and S Harries, Moama, T and M Dunn, Moira, J and A Ashton, Hay, and J and A Robertson, Deniliquin. So in the end, it seems that the family did acknowledge, and obviously the police investigation had ruled out other possibilities, and that it was Thomas Harries who unfortunately decided to jump off the bridge and end his life in that day in 1891.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.